All right, so we want to get one of these notices from the repeating group when clicked into its own panel over here where we can edit the description. So if we're just thinking through that for a second, we need an input in order to edit that description. So let's start there. Let's grab a multiline input, okay? And we want that ultimately to be taking one of these notices, whichever one is clicked. So first things first, like we want this multiline input to be displaying the description that already exists in order for us to edit it, right? So let's just cover that separately quickly. I'll call this the multiline input selected notice. And we actually have this field called initial content. So that is determining what is the value of this multiline input going to be when the page is loaded. So for us, we want that to obviously be pointing to some existing notice. Now, to get one of the notices descriptions from this repeating group is another step, but just to show you this in action before we get going, I could, for example, grab the first item from this repeating group notice. So I'll grab the repeating group notice list of notices and grab the first item and then grab the description of that item. Okay, and that's going to then give me that description for that first notice. So that's, that's as we would expect. And we'd want some kind of button underneath here, right? Which we'll click save. Okay, and when that button is clicked, then we actually save that notice's description to be, the new value from this multiline input. But now we're still faced with the problem of, okay, how do we populate this multiline input with the value of whatever cell we click over here? Remember a few videos ago, we were talking about pushing data from our application to the database, okay? And anytime that we are pushing, that means that we're using workflows, okay? In this scenario, okay, we're going to be clicking on one of these text elements, and that's going to then push the value of that element into this multiline input, okay? So that's telling us that we also need to use workflows in order to achieve this. We're not going to be able to have this multiline input react or reference an element here in the repeating group. I mean, in a way we are able to do that, right? We could grab like any item from this. We could grab the first, the last, or like a particular number, like item number 2. Okay, but that's obviously not dynamic. Like we want our users to be able to click on the cell in this repeating group and automatically populate this. So we need workflows to do this. So what I'll do is I'll click on one of these texts and I'll click Start Edit Workflow. Okay, and that's going to act just like a button, right? When that text is clicked, that's the event in which we're going to anchor some actions. The action that we're actually looking for is under Element Actions, Display Data. And you can see that it's under this group heading here. We aren't actually able to push data or display data in a visual element. We're only able to do that for groups, okay? Now, for this to all sort of come together and make sense, I need to layer in one other, feature of bubble here. So bear with me. I want to put this multiline input in a group, okay? So I could grab a group onto the page and drag it in. And, another quick way of doing this, if I just quickly undo this, if I right click on this multiline input, I can click on this option, Group Elements in a Group, right? And now we have this group B, which inside is our multiline input. So I'll just make it a little bit larger and put our save button in it as well. And I'll rename it to Group Selected Notice, right? Now, if I was to set the type of content here to be a notice and grab, just like we were doing for this multiline input, grab like the first item from that repeating group of notices, this repeating group over here, okay? That's perfectly valid sort of expression. And since this multi-line input is sitting inside of the group, I actually have this really cool option now. If I clear this expression, for the initial content, I can just grab the parent group notices description. Because that multi-line input is inside of that group, okay, it's a child of that group, and that group has some data inside of it, okay, I can actually sort of like pull that down, so to speak, into the multi-line input, okay? And that's giving us a clue, okay? Because once we get data into this group, right, I'll quickly sort of sketch that so it makes sense. Here's our repeating group, right, with entry A, B, C. Over here, we've got just like a normal group, okay, with like a text input over here, okay? Now, that text input can take sort of the value of the group as its own value, okay? And that group, if we remember, can actually take the value of one of those cells when one of those cells is clicked. So we can go straight from the repeating group to the group and then pull that value through into the text field, right? So that this push action here corresponds to that display data action down here. So where we're going to display that data is going to be in our group selected notice. And what data are we going to display? Well, of course, we're going to take the current cell's notice. Okay, so notice that, I'm using the word notice a lot. Notice that we're clicking the text, right? But because that text is inside of a cell, right, Bubble is intelligent enough to know that we're actually taking the current cell, the cell in which the text we clicked inhabits or lives, right? We can take the value of that notice and then we can, of course, display it inside of another group. So we're going from the cell to the group, right? And then once it's in the group, right, then automatically it's going to be pulled through into the multi-line input via this expression here. We don't have to do any other workflows in order to get it into this multi-line. So this data source here, I'll leave for a moment and just refresh the page. This is how this is showing right now. We've got, if I inspect this group selected notice, right, it has this value in it, hello world, this is a notice, that's a description field. But if I click on another notice, then all of a sudden that text changes. And that's because the underlying group, right, where that multi-line input lives, has now another notice in it. Also, to see this, a little bit more granular, I can click on one of these and then I can actually see, look, we are displaying the data and I can see exactly what value is actually being pushed through. All right, so now that that's in there, the last thing that we have to do is just configure this button in order to make changes to the notice that lives inside of that group. So we'll do that in the next video.